I should add that I am working with a doctor in psychology at UBC on some research, but I'm working as a psychotherapist at Vancouver Coastal Health in North Vancouver. I was fascinated by Louis' presentation and very grateful for it because it's given a very good background. I first of all wrote a very long paper and had to cut it right down. So it is cut right down to 7 pages. And Louis has covered, or Dr. Hoffman has covered a lot that I thought I probably should say. And of course don't have to. If anybody would like my full paper later, please do let me know and I will email it to you. I'm going to start with a quote by a Chinese philosopher, how appropriate, by Lao Tzu. Those with outward courage, dare to die. Those with inward courage, dare to live. This paper will discuss existential therapy in terms of 4 main points: what it is, why we need it now, its importance in the prevention and treatment of psychosis, and the obstacles to its wider use. What is existential psychotherapy? Very briefly, Rollo May, father of the American existential movement, wrote in his book Existence that existential psychology seeks to analyze the structure of human existence. An ambitious attempt, ambitious goal. Analyze the structure of human existence. What are the basic tenets? Ervinia Lohm focused on the 4 main givens of the human condition: death, freedom, isolation, meaninglessness. Not light topics. The aim of existential psychotherapy is to accompany the client on a therapeutic journey towards the answers of: who am I? What matters to me? How shall I handle the anxieties of being human? What is my responsibility? How shall I express my fullest humanity? Accessing courage is a main focus of existential practice. Courage is a beacon of light and a source of energy that often needs to be reignited within the client with the help of the therapist. Courage becomes partner to the will. Van Derzen Smith said, "It is in rising to our most difficult challenges that our blood runs in our veins again and that we become awake again. Whereas we fall asleep as long as we avoid pain and trouble, and we find ourselves dead before we know it." Why do we need existential therapy now? We need this type of therapy now because our society's got off track with its emphasis on the quick fix, on popping pills to alleviate symptoms rather than on encouraging exploration of the meaning of the symptoms and the need for growth which the symptoms point toward. Breakdown is not a catastrophe. It's not a catastrophe requiring a chemical fix to return the human being to previous functioning. Breakdown is an invitation for exploration, growth, and development of greater self-awareness and fulfillment. This inner work cannot be achieved by suppressing symptoms or by replacing thoughts with a state of prolonged, medicated quiescence. There was a poem written. I used to teach English as a high school teacher for many years. And there was a poem written that began, "A crumbling wall is a good thing." And I sometimes use that with my clients when they feel that their life has crumbled. A crumbling wall is a good thing because it lets the light in. We need existential therapy now because most other therapeutic modalities do not concern themselves with the soul. I talk of soul not in the religious sense, but in its original meaning from the Greek word psyche. Iatry means care of, psyche means soul. Psychiatry was care of the soul in the original. Some would say the soul is the essential part of ourselves. The idea of the soul is antithetical, however, to scientific inquiry, and therefore the existential approach to therapy has met with considerable resistance, especially in the last few decades, when mental illness has been thought and hoped to be purely biological and therefore fixable with medication. Research into the efficacy of existential psychotherapy has been considered too challenging until recently. Happily, this resistance is just beginning to shift. Elio Frattaroli, a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst at the University of Pennsylvania, author of a great book which I've just read, Healing the Soul in the Age of the Brain. Healing the Soul in the Age of the Brain. He writes that psychopharmacology has replaced psychotherapy because brain has replaced mind. That is, chemical imbalance has replaced inner conflict as the philosophical basis for psychiatric explanation. Frattaroli states that the so-called medical model of psychiatry no longer treats anxiety as an essential aspect of the human condition, an adaptive signal of emotional conflict that needs tending to. Rather, the medical model treats anxiety as a disorder, a brain defect, something that leaves you branded with a 5-digit code number. Along the same lines, Daniel Dorman, MD, an assistant professor of psychiatry at UCLA, writes, "Despite my medical training, I never bought the medical model of mental distress. Depression, a clinical term for sadness, is seen as a symptom of mental disease, as is anxiety, fear, panic, terror, and nearly all the rest of our emotional lives. To conceptualize feeling states only as illnesses or chemical reactions is to equate the brain with mind, and thus a denial of human experience." Richard Tarnas, psychologist and philosopher, said at the Tipping Point Prophets Conference at Simon Fraser University 2 weeks ago, this is what Tarnas said: "We have objectified the world so it can be measured. We have removed interiority." He used the Greek word kairos, meaning the right moment for a shift, to state that it is now that we need to reclaim the metaphysical side of the world which has been destroyed since the Enlightenment. I always find a great irony in that name, Enlightenment. Destroyed the metaphysical side of our existence as human beings. He added that it is not that reason is the problem, but it is the certain form of reason that excludes spirit. We are suffering from metaphysical myopia. It's existential therapy and psychosis. Van Derzen-Smith states that R.D. Laing's vivid descriptions of the subjectivity of psychotic experience leave no doubt at all that much of so-called mental illness is an extreme form of existential misery that can be understood and worked with. It is my experience that it is not part of general policy to provide psychotherapy for people who have been or are currently in psychiatric wards. Currently, treatment involves medications, case management, psychoeducation groups, and if one is lucky, rehab in the form of pottery, art, music, fitness, and yoga. All very nurturing activities. But psychotherapy is not available, even when requested by the clients or by the families. I would like to see a shift in our society away from the emphasis on diagnosis and medications towards a greater understanding of the complexities and the spiritual needs of the human being. Research is needed so that we can prove the efficacy of existential psychotherapy and receive funding to use this therapy for the well-being of those people who at present are condemned to live below their level of potential recovery. Below are thoughts from other people in the field with a similar philosophy of healing. Daniel Dorman, 2008, suggests that the psychotic person's explanations are examples of the very same struggles as anyone else's, namely his effort to resolve inconsistencies in order to preserve his personal identity, his I. The experience of psychosis is the experience of the dissolution of self at the time of life when one begins to enter adulthood and the larger world. Admittedly, one can have a psychotic episode later on in life, but it's just very, very common amongst the young, the adolescents. Dorman saw the use of medication as a means to suppress symptoms without touching the individual, her core, her meaning, or why she suffered. One of my own theories about a possible cause of psychosis, not discounting genetic vulnerability or situational catalyst, is it's a crisis of meaning, a refusal at the deepest level to become part of an environment that is sensed to be contributing to the dissolution of self. I feel conflict as a professional as I try to help individuals adapt to the troubled society they have emerged into from adolescence. Are they mad when they cannot submit their psyches to become part of and party to the dis-ease around them? Could it be a revulsion as a result of their realization that their youthful hopes were illusions? As a therapist, I need to be honest. I need to validate their sense of horror and resistance to the world they have inherited. I need to link their internal unease to the unease of society and of the planet itself, and not pretend that they are the crazy ones. I need to validate their inability or refusal to join the broken reality offered by us, their elders. An attempt at prevention of psychosis or immunization against might be the creation in our society of a meaningful rite of passage for youth awakening to adulthood, as many other societies have done in the past. And I've not looked into this, but I was talking about it to someone the other day, and they said that Gaelic and Celtic traditions might offer an idea here to investigate. I do know that my children's age, I have 3 kids all grown up in their 20s and early 30s, and they are looking for new and meaningful ways to baptize their children, to have their marriages. And I was talking to them a little bit about rite of passage. And of course the bar mitzvah is for the 13-year-old Jewish youth. It's a little bit young, I think, for general population, but maybe it's something we might consider thinking about creating, a rite of passage. We need to acknowledge the shadow side of ourselves with the rite of passage. It does not need stating that the human being has impulses and forces within that are destructive as well as positive. These impulses need to be challenged and channeled in a meaningful and creative way. Richard Tarnas, the philosopher at the conference 2 weeks ago, Tipping Point, asks why we don't have rites of passage which allow adolescents to get in touch with the anima. He suggests a rite of passage might help channel adolescents' shadow energy in a constructive direction and circumvent the development of the sociopath. My clinical experience suggests a possible link between psychosis and moral unease. Some of my clients, are tormented by self-loathing as a result of a perceived egregious act or way of being. An extreme lack of acceptance of self at a core level results in torment. Torment must be escaped. Detachment and alienation can follow. By being willing to walk with the client in their inner world, the therapist builds a relationship of trust and caring that will hopefully help build a bridge to the outer social world. How am I doing for time? 5 minutes left? Okay, last section. Obstacles to existential therapy and causes for optimism. Richard Johnson stated in 1971, the psychotherapist who tries to function within the confines of structured psychological institutions soon encounters a deep resistance to existentialism. He soon discovers that the excitement generated by existential study is circumscribed and cannot assuage the pain of his own immediate aloneness. He is still told in the routine of his own professional world that he must do the job of a psychologist as we define it or get out. I use that quote carefully. I took it out, put it in, took it out, and put it back. I've put it back because it speaks for me, but I didn't want to make this a particularly personal podium. But it is a lonely business being an existential psychotherapist in a large organization. And you have to work under an umbrella. You have to sort of hide it. Thomas Saz wrote, during recent decades, the canons of respectable scholarship and journalism alike have virtually mandated that we view only biological, reductionistic explanations of human behavior as scientific. Michael Polanyi wrote in Scientific Beliefs journal, we dread to be caught believing, and in fact knowing, things which are not demonstrable by the measurement of observed variables. We look carefully over our shoulders and pick our words appropriately to avoid saying anything metaphysical, for fear of offending the ruling assumptions about the strictly mechanical origin of science. The above statements will likely ring true for many existential therapists. However, some progress can be celebrated. In 2006, the American Psychological Association Presidential Task Force on Evidence-Based Practice released a policy statement which acknowledged the value of an increased range of sources of scientific evidence. These included clinical expertise, patient characteristics, culture, and preferences, all as relevant to good outcomes. It is an exciting breakthrough, particularly to have the importance of clinical expertise recognized by APA, the American Psychological Association, as a matter of policy. A cause for optimism locally is the topic that I just mentioned, that Vancouver Coastal Health Research Institute has granted three of us an award a grant to do research. We'll be researching the efficacy of the recovery narrative story, as you mentioned too, as a treatment for people with bipolar disorder. So I'm going to be doing this research starting next month, eliciting recovery narratives, and we will be researching the efficacy of this as a treatment, an alternative type of treatment, as people write their own stories. Carl Schneider writes, existential psychotherapy is in a prime position to lead the next wave of reform in clinical practice. It is both complementary to and integrative of other practice modalities. Not only is it concerned with the clinical influences of biology, environment, cognition, and social relations, but it's also concerned with the transpersonal features that underlie those modalities. Schneider asks, how much longer can existential therapy afford to maintain the position of an elite, underutilized movement? He describes in his book he describes his book, Existential Integrative Psychotherapy, as a plea to the psychotherapy community to wake up and recognize existential dimensions of diversified practice. For, he says, without the existential, without the understanding of a person's relation to being, such practices too often devolve into adjustment rituals that quell but do not necessarily transform. He continues, existential mainstream collaboration is not only desirable but imperative if we are to advance the cause of whole and substantive transformation of lives. He wrote that in 2008. Final paragraph. I agree with Schneider that existential therapy is in a prime position to lead the next wave of reform in clinical practice. The quantitative experimental tradition in psychology is increasingly acknowledging the validity of qualitative designs and approaches, such as the recovery narrative. I am hopeful that academics and clinicians will take every opportunity as quickly as possible to pursue research into the efficacy of existential therapy. Like Carl Schneider, I feel an urgency about it as I see what I believe to be a tragic waste of healthcare resources and a waste of youthful promise resulting from the current funding priorities. However, there is also much cause for optimism as this gathering at a conference on personal meaning testifies. I believe that a shift in consciousness is already happening, and on that note, I will end with two famous and optimistic quotations. Rollo May. Rather than human being, we should call ourselves human becoming. And Einstein, you probably all know this one, but I like it so much. No problem can be solved from the same consciousness that created it. We must learn to see the world anew. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosalind. We have about 5 minutes only, so depending on how complex your question is, we can field one or more questions, so feel free.
Yeah.
I don't have a question. I just want to say that was really very, very nicely stated. I too, as being an English high school teacher, find so much admiration that you went the next step to supporting supporting courage with our students or teenagers, youth, to become the people that they have, the power within them that we see as teachers, but in the conformity of education, there really isn't an outlet, and you give them that outlet.
Thank you. Thank you. When I was an English teacher, which I was for a long time, 20 years, I taught mythology. And Joseph Campbell, obviously, I brought him in to the curriculum. And I offered an assignment called The Hero's Journey, where each student was the mythological hero of their story. And we talked obviously about courage and overcoming inner demons. And that in mythology, it's so often, it's the Theseus and the Minotaur, an outside demon or dragon or bull. But we've all got our own, every one of us has. And if we can bring that to consciousness and let that be the norm, so you're scared and you think you're the only one, you are unable to write your exam because of anxieties. You meet them where they are and you have that anxiety be the demon that you're going to conquer together. You externalize it and you normalize it. So that was an exciting route, that assignment. Interesting, you were an English teacher too. Yeah. Any other questions?
I think you really stir things up,
Do you?
Yes. I think it's a great comfort for somebody who has lack or too much of 5-hydroxytryptamine or something of that kind. It's a great comfort to the therapist too, because you don't have to do much work.
Oh, I challenge that. The therapist doesn't have to do much work?
No, you just prescribe the pills.
Oh, I see what you mean. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
You don't have to start scraping away the varnish and
No,
into the
that's it.
stuff.
No, just give them the medicated quiescence, the chemical straitjacket. Chemical straitjacket. Yeah. It does stir things up. I spoke with psychiatrists don't like speaking to me, obviously. But I was privileged to meet this really great guy, a psychiatrist, who was instrumental recently, just last December, maybe some of you went to the conference Into the Light, put on by Canadian Mental Health, Canadian CMHA, and this fantastic psychiatrist and a few other innovative, inspirational souls. And Into the Light, this conference, which was in Vancouver last December, was about bringing mental illness into the light. And it was a result of the Kirby Commission's report, Out of the Shadows. Senator Kirby had that. He commissioned a report that came down in 2008. And it was to try to work towards reducing stigma and to bring the topic up as a normal topic, not something that you had to run away from. So this conference Into the Light was fantastic, and this particular fantastic psychiatrist was brave enough to say to me, he said, it has been a huge disappointment to psychiatry in the last year or so that we have discovered that it is not purely a brain problem, and it cannot be cured purely by meds. And we have to admit we don't understand mental illness. So I thought that was really brave of him to say, and I honor him for his honesty. But the sad thing is that the psychiatrists that I see predominantly don't behave that way. And they cling tightly to this model that, to me, is becoming immoral. Because there's enough evidence out here now to show the complexity of mental illness. And to prescribe a medication to calm the symptoms to such an extent that they get into a quiescent state for life, chronicity. And I've seen young people come in who I felt sure I could help. And I had one or two opportunities to relate and connect. And then I wasn't allowed to because they were too ill and they needed just psychiatry. And it was far beyond, they felt, my role. So anyway, I'm not going to get into that. Don't want to be negative. But anyway, there's so much that is positive that's happening. I do think there is a turning point, that all the consciousness raising that we've heard about in these rooms in the last few days, that I heard about at the Tipping Conference at SFU 2 weeks ago, at Anaheim last December. Fantastic. Oh, can I? Okay. So consciousness, I do really think we're at an exciting time, and that if ever there was a time, and your beautiful presentation yesterday was all about this, was tapping into our higher self and trying to, speak it out. Because the more of us that do becomes a common language and it becomes the norm. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Welcome and good afternoon. Being the literal person that I am, I thought that the whole presentation had to be something to do with our work world. What I'm going to present to you is a process that you can use in the work world to anchor yourself if there's a situation or a circumstance. But
the presentation has since morphed itself into anchoring yourself, a 1, 2, 3-step process to psychological well-being. My name is Therese Beaudry, and I'd like to thank Dr. Paul Wong for this incredible opportunity to present my findings and dedicate this presentation to my 2 adult children who live their lives unconditionally in truth and love. The roadmap of my presentation will be a personal introduction to who I am, a presentation to an introduction to the research of a master's thesis paper that I did on the role of intuition and reasoning, and then introduce and define this developing 3-step approach, integrating self as paramount to our physical or psychological well-being, giving greater meaning to our life. I was raised in an isolated small mining town about 30 miles south of the Canadian border in northeastern Minnesota, where intuitive intelligence was not a stranger to my thought process, my sensory language, threaded in all conversation, and as a core of experiential reference. What I found interesting is when I moved to Santa Cruz, California, to be closer to relatives with this intrigue of Western or the California culture, and closer to my great aunt in San Francisco, I found that the core of my epistemology, the intuitive and sensory components that were so familiar to all of my life meeting, were no longer part of a conversation as a level of awareness to experience. My conversations with parents, with professional world, in academic education, and the intuitive wisdom of the unconscious were never openly discussed in this new modern contemporary culture. Linear logic seemed to trump intuitive knowing, which I had always accepted as insightful, valid, and credible knowledge. My hope with this presentation is that you will understand your position in life as a collective community, imperative to a cohesive and collaborative work environment, or however you find it, whatever circumstance, whatever experience you have. It is your responsibility to understand how your response to differing situations affects the greater good. Your presence can construct a sustainable positive effect with others or deconstruct the environment to a negative and dysfunctional community. As you listen to this presentation, I invite you to understand the interconnectedness of our conscious, subconscious, and unconsciousness as vital to life meaning. This interconnection brings together an awareness this interconnection brings awareness to that which is apparent, our emotional attachment to what is apparent, and combined with a meaning that is greater than the experience itself. So, in other words, this 1, 2, 3-step process that I named this development, which I should say, well, I'll get into that later, associates itself to the facts of experience, to your emotional attachment to those facts, and how to gain greater awareness to the experience than what the experience is itself. So, back to the morphing of my presentation today. The paper, the research that I did was on intuition and reasoning. And then I decided to dip from education, dip myself into psychology. I was accepted into a PhD program in transpersonal psychology, where I was introduced to Ken Wilber's actually his philosophies, his teachings on transpersonal psychology. And with that, I became aware of the pre-rational and trans-rational awareness, levels of awareness. So the pre-rational, and I added rational, because I felt like you need to know the facts of a situation. I felt that there were 3 levels of awareness to every experience. One are the facts, the objective facts to the experience. 2 is the understanding your emotional attachment to what you know. And then the 3rd is the unconscious, or the trans-rational, which gives you a greater knowing than the experience itself. Discovery of these components to your response and experience, you awaken trans-rational awareness, which diffuses the crisis moments of the experience. This allows your response to speak in a voice of solidarity with heart and mind. So I'm going to tell you what inspired this whole process. The 1, 2, 3-step process to psychological well-being combines the research on intuition's role with our reasoning and recently completed coursework in transpersonal psychology, healing approaches, and transpersonal theory. From the coursework in the transpersonal psychology, my curiosity furthered my inquiry, connecting ideas of psychological wellness with intuitive intelligence as a significant component to trans-rational meaning. Research, so then from my intuition, my intuitive intelligence research, I was asked to give more validation to what I knew to be true with intuition. So I got that empirical, the empirical evidence that I do. John Dylan Haynes at the Bernstein Center for Neuroscience discovered neurological changes in thought using the MRI machine, or the magnetic resonance imaging machine, proving the urge to react to a response or to experience is 10 seconds before you consciously are aware of what you're going to do. Tom Eschel, a psychologist at Norway's University, monitored activity, discovering that brainwaves disrupt signals preceding a person's mistake up to 30 seconds. Somewhat we get in our own way of making correct decisions. He argues, or the best decision to a experience. He argues the best reasons for some choices are understood on our unconscious level first, before the cerebral thinking process for the solution. Tom Miller, a neuroscientist at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, developed the integrative theory, which defines the brain as always pursuing a response to experience from the unconscious. His research found the prefrontal cortex of our brain is the conductor directing all activities of the brain with insightful sensations, or the aha moments that we get. And finally, Caltech neuroscientist Richard Anderson discovered through tuning in on electrical dialogue between working neurons in the brain, he discovered we have free choice cells that circuit in milliseconds, synchronizing all those scattered synapses to settle on one course of action. He showed our decisions are made deeper in the subcurrents of our brain. It's not all that cerebral decision making. So, as I began exploring the process of transpersonal theory, I wondered, how does this intuition impact the multiple levels of our awareness? Reading Ken Wilber's relationship of pre-rational, trans-rational awareness and psychological well-being, I started to connect an association of intuition as extraordinary and pivotal component to our trans-rational awareness. For myself, to connect intuitive intelligence with life meaning, I must have a peaceful mind. I must tune into a deeper level of understanding of life experience. This seemed to be the connection of transrational awareness and life experience. And when I was thinking about this and that solitude, that peaceful part of our getting your mind peaceful and where everything's working, actually, when our minds are peaceful and we are working in this transrational experience, I was reminded of experiences in my youth in the way that I developed this peace with nature. Walks in the woods, listening and being at one with experience gave greater than the experience itself. I especially disciplined a peaceful mind when playing a nameless game with animals. The challenge was to get as close as possible to the animal without frightening the animal or being frightened. And I did this with peaceful silence. The approach was silent, the eye contact was void of emotion and filled with compassion. The deer, the moose, the lynx, the mountain lion, the bird, the owl, the wolf, the chipmunk watched closely as I did with them. This experience was shrouded with trust and respect. I found peaceful mind in the practices of Roman Catholicism as we prayed to saints spiritually connected to the something more, Huxley's something more, and had meditation as a family, as well as alone infusing spirituality into life meaning. These practices brought me intimately close to experience life meaning as greater than the experience itself. So consequently, as I'm evolving with this psychological lessons and learning, when I learned psychologists, teachers, doctors, and scientists are proving disciplines of the mind, being physical, spiritual, and psychological, I immediately connect with my experiences with nature. And I agree. There is greater experience to life meaning than that which seems apparent. So I began to connect with the principles I began to connect with the many transpersonal guides, however, most especially with Paula Underwood Spencer and Ken Wilber. Paula Underwood Spencer speaks of life meaning through metaphors of nature. She gives meaning to my greater than life experiences with nature. Ken Wilber's contemporary approach to life meaning through levels of psychological awareness connects with a process I am familiar to understand different circumstances. For myself, Paula Spencer's nature principles ground the lessons of Ken Wilber's multiple levels of awareness, with knowing life meaning as greater than the experience itself. Knowing life meaning as greater than the experience itself. How vitally important for us to understand and make meaning of our life existence. So I began to wonder, how do I make meaning of life as greater than life itself? What is the process to know life meaning as greater than the experience itself, both in times of emotional discord and in harmony? Ken Wilber's pre-trance fallacy began to swirl in my head. Rational awareness relates to the apparent facts of circumstance. Pre-rational awareness identifies emotional attachment to the apparent facts. Transrational awareness is pre-rational awareness with found value beyond self. Here's where I believe intuition, the intuitive wisdom, becomes important. I feel the intuition is the metaphorical language of the unconscious, connecting pre-rational awareness to the greater than the circumstance itself. Rational awareness is the circumstance as it appears to you. What is apparent in defining this experience? Pre-rational is a self-sense, or as Ken Wilber states, solo sense, creating meaning to life experience based on personal attachment. Transrational awareness gives meaning to circumstance with and beyond the circumstance itself. This awareness gives you the deeper level of awareness that creates meaning with the experience or to base the decision. So why are these levels of awareness important to understand? Contemporary culture seems to create meaning beginning and ending with self-sense. There's a focus on specific experience, examine it, create meaning without the value beyond the emotional attachment. This creates a perspective of experience that is narrow and inconclusive. Thinking about developing the 1, 2, 3-step process to psychological well-being, I found Wilber's concept of transrational awareness to keenly and instantly create awareness to experience that simultaneously interacts with the conscious, subconscious, and unconscious, and the something more. Rational awareness, or conscious mind, begins a process by recognizing past circumstances as familiar patterns to present experience. Conscious awareness scaffolds this logical sequence of understanding to the experience. Pre-rational awareness then attaches your emotional engagement based on recognizing these patterns. This creates limited and ego-based awareness. The transrational awareness accesses implicit knowledge to the circumstance. This explicit knowledge of the explicit knowledge of pre-rational awareness combines with a higher order awareness, creating transrational knowing. Transrational knowing cannot be explained when you're in that experience or that state. It's that awareness of knowing. This knowledge is known as a something more, which is powerfully valid and authentic to the experience. From this lens, you are given truth meaning to a situation, acknowledging yet free of emotional attachment. When connected to transrational awareness, you gain that higher, greater wisdom and clarity with life meaning. How do these levels of awareness concretely define this process of well-being? Rational awareness addresses the facts known to a problem or experience. This understanding is critical information. This information creates vital awareness to the rational factors from which the problem is rooted. Simply stated, step 1 examines and evaluates the circumstance, giving form and structure to what is rooted in the problem. Step 2, pre-rational awareness identifies your personal attachment to the facts experienced in the rational circumstance. Simply stated, this awareness identifies the self-sense to the circumstance you are experiencing. You identify your personal culture, creating meaning to that experience. Step 3, transrational awareness combines the pre-rational, your attachment to the situation, with a greater than or something more awareness to your experience. Simply stated, it validates the intuitive feel, the unitive wisdom that gives deeper, greater meaning than what seems to be apparently so. So what effect does this process bring? The experience of the 1, 2, 3-step process of psychological well-being is an active awareness to an experience as truth and love greater than the experience itself. Awareness to the greater than the experience itself will guide experience meaning with rich resources of the unconscious knowledge or the intuitive and something more that connects with the conscious recognition. What is needed is to listen and accept greater awareness of our unconscious knowing. From this, you will gain a wiser, and more powerful experience the sense of self in the experience. So how do we listen and accept? To listen and accept and connect to the greater knowledge of your unconscious, you can anchor yourself in the practices of yoga, developing imagination and creativity, dream journals, and meditation. These activities are just a few that can give you access to the intuitive knowledge of your greater knowing. I will conclude this presentation, and I'd like to make this dream journal. I never did that before until I took these prerequisite courses for this program with the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. And I was told to reflect on a dream I had. And when we're talking about the unconscious, so I had this vivid dream. And so we were supposed to draw an image of the dream. And in my head, there were explicit details to that dream. And when I was given this assignment to draw it, I was amazed with what happened. I thought that I'm not a very good drawer, and I thought I'd have stick figures and, concrete images. But instead what happened was these swirling motions. It almost looked like a nautilus kind of thing. And I looked at it when I was done, I was like, that's it exactly. So it's amazing what happens in the unconscious, the knowledge of our unconscious. It isn't those explicit, defined, and it wasn't my emotional attachment to that dream. It was something way greater than that. And I didn't go into analyzing that image. In fact, I took a picture of it, and it's hanging in my living room, and it's like wow. Anyway, I conclude this presentation with strongly pushing you to access your trans-rational awareness. I challenge you to explore your inner self and seek the knowledge that gives greater meaning to your existence. This experience spans far beyond the concept of self and life meaning. Referencing the workplace, I would urge you to extend yourself beyond the work relationship of exclusively self and others. I invite you to connect with your inner resource of selflessness. Let go of your emotional attachment that creates separation with your work community. Being similar to what you said, except I heard this other saying, this woman wrote it on a blog in response to something we were talking about. She said, be human as opposed to human being. Be human as opposed to human being. So to conclude this presentation, I look forward to developing the 1, 2, 3-step process to psychological well-being, to explore how I can further elaborate for others this path of awareness on a professional, corporate, and personal level. I see this process to help a person gain more clarity and truth with your experience. The 1, 2, 3-step process to psychological well-being is an invitation, a calling to one's purpose and meaning beyond the personal level and towards a generational level, a guiding light that illuminates the path to trans-rational awareness. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share these insights. Thank you.
Thank you, Therese. We have opportunity for 1 or 3 questions, depending on how long. Actually, about 5 or 10 minutes. So it's an open invitation for anyone to share any thoughts they might have.
Yes.
It was very inspiring for me. How do I follow up and know more about this steps 1, 2, 3? And
Really?
Is this all Ken Wilber's work, or this association you mentioned? This?
Well, sir, actually, it was inspired with, it's my own work, and it's inspired by Ken Wilber's and transrational fallacy. He goes into huge depth with this. But it was my putting together the piece with the intuition and the rational, identify it. I didn't see anywhere that he said first, objectively identify the experience, then go into then he goes huge into, then you doing the emotional attachment to that experience, and then the transrational experience, which combines the attachments with. So I will give you my card,
Please,
and
yes.
I look forward to communication with you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to share any thoughts they might have?